250 Marines cut off behind enemy lines. The ridge lines above them spit fire, tracers carving the night sky into red arcs. Their ammo counts dropped to single digits, their voices on the radio clipped, urgent, already brushing the edge of finality. Reinforcements were hours away. They had minutes. In the command tent, the answer was quiet but brutal: there is no way in. Enemy fighters held every slope, every draw, every choke point. Gunships were pinned down by anti-air. Fixed-wing jets couldn't drop without killing the very men they were sent to protect. The situation, they said, was unsalvageable. That's when one name surfaced: Lieutenant Commander Rachel Torres, Navy helicopter pilot. Not a gunfighter, not a combat ace. The kind of aviator commanders called when cargo needed moving, or when wounded had to be lifted after the fight was already over. The response was almost a laugh. Torres? She's not combat tested. She's a transport driver. She doesn't belong in this fight. But Torres didn't hear their dismissal. She only heard the numbers: 250 Marines about to be erased from the map. She knew her bird wasn't built for this. She knew command wouldn't greenlight it. But she also knew something else. If she didn't try, those Marines wouldn't last the hour. Today's story is about the Navy helicopter pilot who chose to do what nobody else dared and flew straight into hell to bring 250 Marines home alive. Before we dive in, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? I love seeing our military family united across the world. Lieutenant Commander Rachel Torres wasn't the kind of pilot anyone noticed when the squadron gathered in the ready room. She didn't have the booming voice of the fighter jocks or the swagger of the attack pilots. At 5'6", she looked smaller than the machine she commanded, the Navy's MH-60 Seahawk, a bird most people thought of as a taxi, moving people, supplies, and sometimes casualties when the fight was over. She had heard the words too many times to count: Torres, you're support only. You're not a combat asset. Some said it kindly, as though to soften the blow. Others said it with a smirk, a reminder that in their eyes, she'd never be the one to turn a battle. She was the one you called after the battle. But Rachel Torres had never accepted that label. She grew up the daughter of a longshoreman in Corpus Christi, Texas, where the smell of salt water and diesel was as normal to her as the morning sun. Her father taught her early that machines are only as strong as the hands that run them. She carried that lesson into flight school, where she excelled in systems, navigation, and problem-solving. But her quiet style made her forgettable to those who only valued bravado. What her peers didn't know, what no one knew, was how she spent her nights. While others hit the gym or the bar, Rachel locked herself in simulators, running scenarios not in the syllabus. She would build her own missions from scratch: insertions under fire, extractions in narrow valleys, landings on slopes no instructor dared to teach. She studied terrain maps long after the lights went out, tracing contours with her finger until she could picture every escape route blindfolded. The maintenance crews noticed her, though. They'd see her in the hangar after hours, helmet off, hands black with grease as she traced wiring or double-checked hydraulic lines. "You're wasting your time," one chief muttered once. Rachel just smiled. She wasn't wasting time. She was learning her machine in a way few pilots ever did. The scars of near failure stayed with her, too. Years earlier, in a training op off the coast of Virginia, her Seahawk had lost an engine on approach with a full cabin. For 8 seconds, she thought the bird was gone. 8 seconds where gravity had its say before instinct, training, and a stubborn refusal to die pulled her hand to the right place at the right time. They landed hard, skids biting into the sand, but no one was hurt. Her crew remembered her calm, her voice steady over the intercom: "We're not done yet. Ride it with me." But Rachel remembered something else: the taste of failure sitting just a breath away, the knowledge that it could have ended differently. That scar never left. It became her teacher. Back on deployment, Rachel was rarely the first name called when missions got stacked. She was the one shuffled into logistics flights, casualty pickups, or convoy support. Each time she saluted the order and did it. But inside she carried the weight of those dismissals. Support only. It didn't stop her from preparing. She began keeping a worn notebook in her flight bag. In it were sketches of valleys, diagrams of rotor wash in confined spaces, quick math for weight loads under fire, margins filled with notes, engine torque limits under evasive maneuvers, approach angles for rooftop LZs, smoke drift patterns in crosswinds. Her crew chief sometimes joked about it. Rachel's playbook, they called it. She didn't mind. She was building something no one else believed she'd ever use. And in quiet conversations, a few Marines who'd flown with her whispered a different view. "She's steady," they'd say, "doesn't rattle." If you had to bet your life on one pilot setting down in the worst spot on Earth, it might be her. Rachel never heard those words. She only heard the dismissals. But the Marines remembered. By the time the deployment to Afghanistan stretched into its 4th month, Rachel Torres had already drawn lines on maps no one else cared about. She'd circled choke points, noted where convoys might be cut off, where valleys became kill boxes. She studied the ridges through binoculars, memorizing sightlines, imagining worst-case scenarios. Most thought she was obsessive. She thought she was realistic. And when the call came across the radio that 250 Marines were stranded in enemy territory, surrounded, running out of ammunition, Rachel knew with a cold certainty that settled in her chest that this was the nightmare she had been preparing for all along. The Marines had started the day on routine patrol. It was supposed to be simple, a sweep through a stretch of hostile territory that intelligence insisted was quiet. 250 men and women moving in columns along a dusty valley floor, flanked by rocky ridges that rose like jagged teeth against the sky. By mid-afternoon, that quiet broke. The first crack of enemy rifles echoed from the north slope. Then another burst from the south. Within minutes, fire poured down from 3 directions, the ridges alive with muzzle flashes. Mortar rounds thudded into the earth, spraying dirt and rock into the air. The patrol had walked straight into an ambush. Contact. Multiple positions on the ridges, one Marine shouted over the radio. "Taking fire, we need cover," another voice cut in, heavy with panic. They dove for what little shelter the valley offered, scraping into shallow depressions, ducking behind rocks too small to hide a man, let alone a platoon. Ammunition belts rattled as machine gunners set up, laying down suppressive fire that barely scratched the swarm of enemy fighters pouring over the high ground. Within 10 minutes, the Marines were pinned. The company commander, callsign Ironclad 6, tried to steady the chaos. "All stations, maintain sectors. Ammo conservation. We'll hold here." His voice was strong, but the situation was crumbling. Reports filtered in, clipped and urgent. Bravo 2, 1 KIA, 3 WIA. Charlie Squad, ammo down to 5 mags each. They're pushing mortars closer. The valley floor was becoming a kill zone. Every path out was raked with fire. Every attempt to move drew a storm of bullets. At the forward operating base 20 miles away, the command tent lit up with chatter. Drone feeds painted a grim picture, Marines stranded in the open, enemies tightening the noose. "Recommend we hold position until ground reinforcements can punch through," one staff officer said. "That's 4 hours minimum," another replied, glancing at the clock. "They won't last half that." The operations officer looked for air options. Fixed-wing fighters were circling, but their rules of engagement were clear: no drops within 100 meters of friendlies. The Marines had enemies inside 50. Close air support was off the table. A silence stretched in the tent. Everyone knew what that meant. Finally, the battalion commander spoke, his voice low. "We hold. Reinforcements will move as fast as possible." It was, in effect, a death sentence. On the ground, the Marines were already running dry. Machine gunners called out belt counts, down to single digits. Riflemen swapped magazines like they were trading gold. Casualties were mounting. Corpsmen worked frantically in the dirt, blood mixing with dust as they tried to stem wounds under fire. One Marine's voice, shaky and young, crackled over the net. "We can't hold this. We're not gonna." His transmission cut with the sound of incoming rounds. In the command tent, eyes turned to the one map no one wanted to acknowledge. It showed a patrol encircled in red icons with no clear way out. And that's when Rachel Torres stepped forward. She had been standing quietly along the wall, headset still around her neck from an earlier logistics run. She had watched the feeds, listened to the comms, done the math in her head. The Marines weren't going to make it to reinforcements. The rules of engagement didn't matter if every man and woman on that valley floor was gone before sunset. "Sir," she said, voice steady, "my bird can get in there. I know the terrain. I can land on that fold west of their position, run extractions in groups." "It's possible." The operations officer looked at her like she'd lost her mind. "Torres, you're not combat tested. You're a transport driver. That valley is suicide." Her jaw tightened. She had heard those words before, support only, not a combat asset. And yet, 250 Marines were dying while men in the tent shook their heads. She pushed again. "If we wait for reinforcements, they're gone." "I can get in there now. Let me try." The battalion commander didn't even hesitate. "Denied. We're not risking a bird and crew on a suicide run. Stand down." The words hit like a hammer. On the radio, another report came through. "Ironclad 6 to base. We are black on ammo within 30 minutes. Casualties increasing. If we don't get relief," his voice cracked but held, "we will not hold." Rachel closed her eyes. 30 minutes. That was all. She could still see the ridges in her mind, traced from maps she had studied at night. She could see the shallow fold on the west slope that most people ignored. She could picture the angles, the descent path, the way the rotors would kick dust and smoke into a shield if she came in low and hard. She knew the risk. But she also knew the truth. If she didn't try, there wouldn't be anyone left to save. Back in the tent, the chatter continued. Talk of reinforcements, of doctrine, of waiting. But Rachel Torres wasn't listening anymore. She had already made her choice. She pulled her headset back on, voice quiet into the crew net. "Get the bird ready. Full fuel, all countermeasures." "We're wheels up in 5, her crew chief hesitated. "Ma'am, command hasn't." "They won't," Rachel cut him off. "But 250 Marines are running out of time, and if we don't move now, we'll be counting bodies by sundown." Her crew chief met her eyes, then nodded once. "Aye, ma'am, I'll prep her." Outside, the desert sun was beginning to sink, shadows stretching long across the valley where the Marines fought for their lives. In the distance, gunfire echoed like thunder, each burst another reminder they were out of time. And Lieutenant Commander Rachel Torres, dismissed as just a transport driver, was about to prove them all wrong. Rachel Torres sat on the edge of her flight chair, headset cord dangling, eyes fixed on the map projected across the command tent. The red markers kept multiplying, enemy positions tightening like a noose around the Marine patrol. The analysts muttered in clipped tones, running probability charts, casualty projections, reinforcement timelines. All of it boiled down to one truth: the Marines would not survive long enough for help to arrive. But Rachel wasn't looking at probabilities. She was running the numbers her way. Her mind replayed the valley's contour lines she'd studied at night in silence, finger tracing ridges and folds until they were etched into her memory. She could see the slope on the west side, shallow enough for a dangerous landing, narrow enough to give some cover from enemy fire. She knew her MH-60 Seahawk wasn't designed for gun runs, but it could do things most of her peers never practiced. Short, brutal landings. Hard takeoffs with heavy weight. Rotor wash that turned smoke and dust into a moving wall. She whispered the numbers under her breath: descent angle, rotor clearance, torque limits at altitude. She pictured the landing gear slamming into rock, the weight shift as Marines piled in, the torque spike as she yanked the bird back into the sky. It was ugly math, but it added up to one thing: possible. Barely. Her memory yanked her back months earlier, another night alone in the simulator bay. She had keyed in her own scenarios long after the syllabus lessons ended. Friendlies pinned, enemy fire from 3 ridgelines, valley walls so tight the textbook said not recommended. She had flown it again and again, 40 times, until she could hear the rotors thumping in her dreams. Most pilots left the simulator after their 2 assigned hours, joking about who would buy the first round at the bar. Rachel stayed, sometimes until dawn, building battlefields no one asked her to imagine. She memorized terrain features, practiced masking behind ridges, learned to feel the margins of her helicopter like a second skin. She taught herself things no instructor cared to grade. Back in the present, she clenched her jaw. Those nights weren't wasted. They were the only reason she believed she had a chance now. But belief didn't mean acceptance. When she mentioned her plan out loud, land in the fold, run multiple trips under fire, the tent reacted with disbelief, even contempt. "You'll get chewed up in there before your skids touch dirt," one pilot said, shaking his head. "Torres, that's not a gunship." "That's a taxi," another added, his voice laced with a cruel kind of humor. "You want to play hero, but you'll end up a body bag delivery." Their words hit her sharp as they always did. She'd been underestimated her whole career. Transport driver. Support only, never the one trusted to turn the tide. Still, Rachel didn't argue. She never had. She simply lowered her eyes, nodded once, and let them laugh. But inside, her mind kept working. The enemy fire was concentrated on the valley floor and eastern ridges. The western slope, steep, dangerous, but not impassable, was weaker. If she dropped smoke, flares, and used her rotors to whip the dust into a storm, she could carve a shield for seconds at a time. Seconds were all she needed. She imagined the first load of Marines sprinting into the bird, boots thudding on metal, the sheer weight testing her torque limits. She pictured the gauges spiking, the warning tones screaming in her headset. She had flown it in the simulator. She knew exactly where to pull, where to angle, how to slam collective and cyclic in perfect rhythm to claw back into the air. Her heart pounded in her chest as if she were already flying it. One of the senior aviators, a commander with salt and pepper hair, finally spoke with something harsher than mockery. "Torres, you try that, you're not coming back. Do you understand? You'll be a crater on the side of that valley." Rachel didn't flinch. She met his eyes and answered evenly. "Better me than 250 Marines." The tent went silent. The commander shook his head, dismissing her words as reckless bravado. But Rachel meant every syllable. She had no illusions of glory. She knew this was closer to suicide than a mission, but she also knew what it meant to freeze while others bled. She had carried that scar once before when her helicopter nearly went down in training, and she vowed never again to let hesitation be the reason someone died. Her crew chief, Petty Officer Marcus Lee, caught her outside the tent, leaning against the helicopter's tire as though he had been waiting. His voice was low. "You're really going to do it, aren't you?" Rachel exhaled. "They're out of time," Lee nodded slowly. "Then I'm with you." Just say the word. The word steadied her more than she admitted. She wasn't alone. She had one crewman who believed. The roar of distant gunfire carried across the desert, faint but insistent, a reminder that Marines were dying while command debated doctrine. Rachel Torres adjusted the strap of her helmet and made her choice. The voices of doubt still echoed in her ears, support only, transport driver, not combat tested. She let them echo, because soon she'd drown them out with the thump of rotors cutting through fire. And in that moment, for the first time in her career, Rachel Torres felt the weight of every hour she had trained in secret, every map she had traced in silence, every near failure that had scarred her resolve. All of it had led here, to this valley, to this fight, to this chance. The desert heat pressed down like a weight as Rachel Torres strapped into her seat. Every second felt stolen. Command still believed she was standing by, but her Seahawk was already alive, rotors whining as they clawed at the air. Her crew chief, Marcus Lee, moved with the same quiet urgency, slamming panels shut, checking straps, arming countermeasures. No words were needed. They had both made the same choice. Unauthorized or not, they were going. Rachel keyed the intercom. "You still want off this ride, Lee? Now's the time." He grinned through the glass, sun cutting across his face. "Ma'am, if you're going into hell, I'm not watching from the parking lot." She didn't smile, but the corner of her mouth twitched. That was enough. At 2:43 in the afternoon, her MH-60 lifted from the pad, nose dipping forward as she pushed into the sky. No clearance. No call sign. Just the sound of rotor blades ripping the air apart. Back in the command tent, a controller blinked at the radar screen. Sir, we've got an MH-60 departing without clearance." Someone cursed. The battalion commander snapped, "Who the hell is?" But the voice cut out, drowned by Rachel's transmission on the guard frequency. "Any station, this is Seahawk 2-1, inbound to grid 79er. 250 Marines surrounded and running dry. If this is unauthorized, fine, but they're not dying on my watch." Static followed. No one answered. Rachel didn't need permission. As the valley opened ahead, the reality slammed into her harder than the rotor vibrations. Smoke rose in black plumes. Muzzle flashes twinkled across the ridges, like stars in reverse. Enemy fighters had threaded themselves into every crease of the terrain. It looked less like a battlefield and more like a trap designed by someone who knew every weakness of air support. She dropped altitude, hugging the terrain. The Seahawk shuddered as hot air lifted and fell off the rocks. Lee fed her updates from the door gun, voice steady but taut. "Contact left ridge, about 40 shooters. More movement on the east slope. They're closing fast." Rachel's eyes darted between the valley floor and her gauges. Torque was good, temp in the green. But the geometry was the problem. Enemy fire raked across the only approach path, a perfect crossfire box that turned any landing into suicide. She'd trained for this, in silence, in simulators, but this was no sim. Tracers sliced within meters of her rotors, green and red streams crisscrossing the air. For a split second, her instinct screamed, the others were right. She couldn't make it. She was about to become a fireball slammed into the side of a ridge. Then she remembered the trick. The one nobody taught. The one she had practiced until the sim screens overheated. Instead of running the obvious straight-in approach, she cut power, nose up, and dropped into a violent side slip. The Seahawk slid sideways, rotor wash slamming dirt and smoke into a wall between her and the gunners. For 3 heartbeats, she disappeared from their aim, a ghost behind her own storm. "Lee, now!" she barked. He yanked the smoke grenades, purple and red clouds blooming, whipped instantly into a rolling curtain by the rotors. The valley's crossfire vanished into haze. Rachel kicked the rudder, dropped collective, and slammed the bird into the narrow fold she'd memorized from her maps. The skids kissed rock with a jolt that rattled her spine. The Marines didn't hesitate. They had seen impossible rescues before, but never this. The first squad sprinted through dust and smoke, boots hammering metal as they dove into the cabin. Lee shouted numbers, waving them aboard, while Rachel kept her eyes glued to the gauges, waiting for the spike that meant she'd overloaded the bird. Tracer fire stitched the smoke, wild and blind. One round pinged off the fuselage, another chewed into the dirt feet from the rotor. For a moment, it felt like the valley itself was trying to crush them. Rachel yanked collective. The Seahawk groaned, engine screaming at max torque, nose wobbling as weight pressed it down. For one terrifying instant, the skids refused to leave the rock. "Come on, girl," she muttered. One more inch. Then the rotors bit, the nose lifted, and the helicopter clawed free, dragging Sky out of the dirt with sheer willpower. On the ground below, enemy fighters surged toward the fold, rifles raised. They had almost closed the net. Almost. But Rachel was already gone, vanishing into the dust storm she had made, carrying the first dozen Marines on a ride no one had believed possible. The Seahawk bucked and groaned as Rachel forced it through the rising air currents of the valley. The first squad clung to the cabin benches, weapons rattling against the fuselage, adrenaline etched across their faces. Every Marine knew the same thing. They weren't supposed to be alive right now. Rachel shoved the thought aside. She had only seconds before she had to commit again. She banked hard, rotors clawing at the wind, and dropped altitude until her bird skimmed just above the ridgeline. "Lee, how's our load?" she shouted. 14 Marines. We're heavy, but we can lift another stick, he answered, knuckles white around the doorframe. Rachel's jaw tightened. It meant the next landing would be even tighter. The radio cracked alive. Ironclad 6 to any station, we see you, whoever you are, you just bought us time. The Marines below were pinned, firing upward in desperate arcs. When they looked up and saw the gray Seahawk slicing through smoke, they couldn't believe it. A Navy bird, not a gunship, not a medevac, a transport, dropping into their tomb of a valley. Rachel keyed the net, voice calm. This is Seahawk 2-1. I'm coming back for more. Mark with smoke, west side of the fold. I'll thread it. There was a pause. Then a Marine voice answered, incredulous. 2-1, you can't land here. It's suicide. Rachel almost smiled. Watch me. She swung the Seahawk back into the valley, low and fast, rotors chopping smoke into blinding swirls. Enemy gunners tried to track her, but the bird darted between folds of rock, vanishing, then reappearing in bursts. She wasn't flying the doctrine approach, straight in, straight out. She was weaving, cutting angles, scraping the edge of physics. Lee dropped fresh smoke grenades, plumes blooming into purple curtains. LZ's clouded, ma'am, he called, eyes scanning the ridges. Rachel dropped collective, nose up, and bled speed until the bird slammed down again, skid scraping against uneven stone. The Seahawk tilted dangerously left, rotor tips only feet from biting rock. For half a second, it looked like it would roll. Then Rachel's hands moved with instinct, quick adjustments that steadied the wobble. The helicopter shivered but held. Lee, go. Load 'em, Lee yelled, waving Marines aboard. The men on the ground stared for a heartbeat too long. No one had believed a Seahawk could land in that spot, under that kind of fire. For years they'd been told, don't even try. Doctrine says it's impossible. Yet here it was, steel and sweat and rotor thunder, defying every line of the manual. The silence lasted only a moment. Then the Marines surged forward. Boots hammered metal as they piled into the cabin, cramming shoulder to shoulder, eyes wide at the madness they were part of. Rounds smacked the fuselage. Dust sprayed across the windshield. An RPG streaked from the far slope. Rachel yanked cyclic and collective together, lifting just as the rocket slammed into the fold she had vacated a split second before. The blast rattled the helicopter, flames licking the smoke. Lee's voice cracked over the intercom, half awe, half disbelief. Ma'am, they just tried to end us. They missed, Rachel said flatly. Hang on. She punched power, nose down, and threaded through tracer lines so close they looked like burning wires strung in the air. Her eyes never blinked, hands steady, every adjustment measured. She was riding the Seahawk like it was an extension of her own body, something the manuals never taught, something only years of scars and nights of secret practice could create. On the ground, Marines who hadn't made the first lifts froze, watching. Silence spread through the valley, even under gunfire. The pilot they'd been told was just a transport driver had dropped into hell itself and pulled men out alive. Up in the command tent, the radar screens told the same story. Voices that once mocked her now whispered in disbelief. She's in the fold again? Impossible. She can't balance that weight. But the radio from Ironclad 6 cut them all off, raw with awe. Seahawk 2-1, you just put down in a place jets can't touch. Marines are loading. We'll hold for you. Rachel didn't answer. She was too busy flying, too busy forcing her bird through another needle's eye. As the Seahawk clawed sky again, Marines cheered inside the cabin, slapping helmets, gripping their rifles like they were alive for the first time all day. They had just witnessed something doctrine said could never be done. Back at base, silence stretched across the command tent. No one dared to say it yet, but they all knew Rachel Torres had just redefined what support only meant. And she wasn't finished. The Seahawk tore free from the fold, rotors groaning under the weight of Marines crammed shoulder to shoulder inside. Rachel pushed nose forward, weaving the helicopter in sharp zigzags as tracers laced the air. Rounds smacked the fuselage, one cracking the plexiglass inches from her shoulder. The bird shuddered, but the gauges stayed green enough. "Hold on back there," Lee shouted, bracing himself in the doorway, hand on the gun. The Marines clung to each other, dirt-streaked faces pressed against their rifles, silent except for the rasp of breath. Rachel yanked the Seahawk up over a ridge, used the terrain as a shield, then dropped low across the desert. At the forward operating base, medics and crew rushed as she slammed the bird onto the pad. Marines spilled out, some limping, others dragging the wounded. Rachel didn't even shut down. She kept the engine screaming. "Refuel and rearm countermeasures only," she barked. "We're going back." The ground crew stared at her, holes in the fuselage, rotor tips chipped from rock, smoke residue streaking the tail. The bird looked half-broken already. "Ma'am, she won't take another hit like that. She doesn't have to," Rachel cut them off. "She just has to keep flying long enough." The crew chief saw her eyes and didn't argue. Flares were reloaded, smoke grenades tossed back into the cabin, and within 3 minutes she was lifting again, rotors chopping dust into a storm. Back in the valley, the remaining Marines heard the thump of her rotors before they saw her. The sound cut through the chaos like a promise. They'd thought the first run was a miracle, but the miracle was coming back. Enemy fire intensified. Mortars pounded the valley floor, forcing Marines deeper into shallow cover. Ammo counts were nearly zero. Rifle bolts clicked on empty chambers. One sergeant shouted across the net, "Fix bayonets! If they push, we go hand to hand." That's when Rachel's Seahawk ghosted over the ridge again, smoke trails curling around her fuselage. "Seahawk 2-1, inbound, west fold." "Get ready to move," she called, voice flat, unshaken. The Marines cheered, then scrambled. They'd seen her do the impossible once. They weren't about to miss their chance. Rachel dropped collective, nose high, flaring hard into the fold. Skids kissed rock, fuselage wobbling as rounds sparked off the hull. Lee leaned out the door screaming, "Load! Load! Move!" Marines sprinted, diving into the cabin, boots hammering steel. Another 14 bodies crammed inside. A mortar shell detonated 50 meters away, rocking the valley. Shrapnel peppered the bird, sparks showering across the cabin. One rotor blade flexed dangerously, groaning against the strain. Rachel ignored it. She was already pulling collective, torque spiking into the red. The Seahawk clawed upward, staggered, then ripped free of the fold. "Second stick aboard," Ironclad 6 called over the net. "God bless you, 2-1. Rachel had no breath to answer. Her hands were welded to the controls, eyes flicking between the ridges and the gauges. Another RPG streaked from the north slope. She yanked the nose, dropped the bird into a gut-churning dive, flared flares. The rocket streaked past, exploding harmlessly against the rocks. She twisted the Seahawk through the valley like she was threading a needle blindfolded. Each pass was worse than the last, but she didn't stop. The third run was the hardest. By then, the enemy knew what she was doing. Fighters massed on the western ridge, pouring fire into the fold, trying to collapse her lifeline. The Marines on the ground were nearly black on ammo, some down to pistols, others clutching empty rifles like clubs. Rachel came in anyway. She cut power, side-slipped again, rotors whipping smoke into a storm that blinded the ridge gunners. Lee hurled every smoke grenade they had, turning the fold into a swirling wall of purple haze. The Seahawk slammed down hard, skids gouging stone. The Marines hesitated only a heartbeat. Then they charged. Some carried the wounded on their backs. Others dragged ammo cans, unwilling to leave anything behind. "Come on, move!" Lee shouted, hauling men into the cabin like cargo. One Marine stumbled, leg torn by shrapnel. 2 others lifted him under the arms and shoved him aboard. Rachel felt the weight hit her through the controls. The Seahawk sagged, engines howling. She pulled, teeth gritted, as bullets tore through the haze. One round ripped across the cockpit, glass shattering, slicing a shallow line across her cheek. She didn't flinch. She just pulled harder. The bird lifted, wobbling, then surged upward through the smoke. Inside the cabin, Marines shouted, some praying, others laughing with the wild hysteria of men who'd already said their last words but found themselves alive again. 3 trips. 4. each one closer to disaster. The Seahawk bled holes, hydraulic fluid streaking the tail, warning tones chiming in Rachel's headset. Still she kept flying, her arms and legs burning, body moving like machine memory. Finally, only one squad remained, Ironclad 6 and his last men. They had held the perimeter to the end, fighting with bayonets, pistols, and raw grit. Now they were down to knives and empty weapons, surrounded on all sides. "Seahawk 2-1, this is Ironclad 6, the commander said, voice ragged. "We're the last, if you can't make it." Rachel cut him off. "Not leaving you. Pop smoke." "I'll find you." There was silence, then the hiss of a grenade. A thin orange plume rose from the rocks. Rachel banked hard, nose down, diving straight into the heart of enemy fire. Tracers crisscrossed the air, a web of death waiting to cut her down. The Seahawk groaned, holes tearing wider in its skin. "Lee, last ride," she said softly. "Aye, ma'am," he replied, jaw set. The skids slammed down near the smoke. Marines surged toward her, firing their last rounds, throwing rocks, even swinging rifle butts to buy seconds. 2 went down under enemy fire. Their comrades lifted them, refusing to leave. Lee grabbed them one by one, hauling, shoving, cursing until the cabin was full to bursting. "That's all of them." "That's everyone." Rachel's eyes flicked to the ridges. Enemy fighters were sprinting downhill, closing to within 30 meters, rifles raised. Too close. Too late. Unless she pulled every ounce of power left, collective jammed to the stump. The Seahawk screamed, tail shuddering, rotors biting at air like teeth on bone. The bird lifted, sagged, then staggered upward, nose pitching dangerously. Tracer rounds tore past. One hit the tail boom with a sickening clang. Warning lights flared red across her panel. "Simon, girl," Rachel whispered. "One last climb." The Seahawk shuddered, then leapt, clearing the ridge by feet. Below, the enemy fighters stopped and stared, weapons useless against the miracle rising out of the dust. Inside the cabin, Marines cheered, roared, some weeping openly as the bird clawed toward the horizon. Rachel didn't cheer. She just held the controls steady, blood running from the cut on her cheek, eyes locked on the gauges. Every vibration told her the Seahawk might come apart before they made it home, but the Marines were aboard. All of them. Minutes later, the battered bird limped over the perimeter of the FOB. Ground crews stared as it approached, riddled with holes, tail smoking, rotors groaning. It touched down with a jolt, skids bending, engines coughing as Rachel finally cut power. The cabin doors slammed open. Marines poured out, dragging the wounded, shouting, cheering, slapping the fuselage like it was alive. Every single one of them accounted for. 250 Marines. Not one left behind. Rachel Torres sat in the cockpit, hands trembling now that it was over. Her headset crackled with the final call from Ironclad 6, Seahawk 2-1, be advised, all Marines exfil complete, 0 left behind. You just saved 250 souls. For the first time all day, Rachel allowed herself a breath. She closed her eyes, blood and sweat streaking her face, and whispered back, "Copy that." The Seahawk sat smoking on the flight line, rotors winding down with a tired groan. Panels were bent, fuselage riddled with holes, paint scorched black in streaks. It looked more like wreckage than an aircraft that had just flown 5 combat runs into hell and back. Rachel Torres unstrapped slowly, every muscle trembling from strain. Her hands were still shaking as she lifted her helmet, sweat-soaked hair plastered to her forehead. For the first time all day, she let herself feel the exhaustion. Then she heard it. Boots pounding, shouts rising. Marines, the very ones she had pulled from the valley, were forming up on the line, dirty, bloodied, some still limping from wounds but standing tall. And as Rachel climbed down from the cockpit, they moved as one. They saluted. 250 Marines, their faces lit by the floodlights, raising their hands in a gesture that silenced the entire flight line. No one moved. No one spoke. The only sound was the quiet hum of the helicopter cooling. Rachel froze, the weight of it hitting harder than any bullet. She had been told her whole career she was support only, that she was a transport driver, not a combat asset. Yet here were 250 Marines proving those words wrong with a single motion of respect. Behind them, the command staff arrived. The battalion commander's face was stone, his voice sharp. "Lieutenant Commander Torres, you departed without authorization. You endangered your crew. You defied direct orders." Rachel stood at attention, her cheek still streaked with dried blood. "Yes, sir. You violated doctrine, flew outside of every acceptable procedure, and put this command at risk." Again, steady. "Yes, sir." The silence stretched. Then Ironclad 6, the Marine Company commander she had lifted last, stepped forward. His voice carried across the flight line. "And she saved every one of my Marines. Not one left behind." The Marines roared in agreement, a wall of sound that shook the tent flaps and rattled the floodlights. The commander looked as though the ground had shifted beneath him. His words faltered. The anger drained into something else, something heavier. Then a new voice spoke, calm, authoritative. An admiral had stepped out from the shadows, hands clasped behind his back. He studied the battered helicopter, then Rachel. His eyes held none of the dismissal she had grown used to. He asked only one question. "Lieutenant Commander Torres, can you teach others how you just did that?" Rachel blinked. For a moment, she thought she'd misheard. Then she answered with the same steadiness she'd carried all day. "Yes, Admiral, I can." The Admiral nodded once. "Good, because doctrine needs to catch up to reality." And reality just proved itself in that valley. Weeks later, Rachel found herself in briefing rooms, her battered helmet on the table, as she explained maneuvers no manual had ever covered. She drew diagrams of folds and ridgelines, taught young pilots how to use rotor wash as a weapon, how to see terrain not as an obstacle but as a shield. The words support only were erased from every slide. Her notes, once scribbled in a private notebook, became official training material. Simulator syllabi changed. Doctrine shifted inch by inch until what had been called reckless became recognized as innovation. She never asked for medals. She didn't care about the ribbon rack on her chest. What mattered was that the next time a valley turned into a tomb, another pilot would know there was a way to draw a line through the impossible and carry Americans home. And on the flight line, Marines still touched her Seahawk when they walked past, battered panels and bullet holes patched with new steel. Not because the machine was special, but because it had carried them out when no one else would. Rachel Torres had gone into hell as just a transport driver. She walked out as proof that courage and skill can change the map and the future of how Americans fight and survive. Some stories don't need embellishment. They just need to be remembered. Lieutenant Commander Rachel Torres wasn't supposed to be the one who changed the course of that day. She was supposed to be support, a transport pilot, someone who followed doctrine and stayed in the shadows. But when 250 Marines were left with no hope, she chose courage over caution and proved that one pilot, one decision, can mean the difference between a valley of graves and a flight line full of salutes. If this story gave you goosebumps, salute in the comments below. And if you believe stories like these should never be forgotten, subscribe to Military and Veteran Stories for more true accounts of valor, sacrifice, and the quiet strength of those who serve. Until next time, stand tall, stay proud, and never forget the heroes who keep us free.